When I posted my review of the 10 worst movies I've done on this show, people thought I was being a bit unfair. I can understand that. After all, I don't always do only negative movies. This time I'm going to take things a bit more upbeat. Going to look at the 10 best movies I've reviewed on this show so far. This movie is full of stuff. From the fears about placing our fates into a higher power, to the logical nature of machines, that if man is causing most harm to man, the best thing to do is to place him under control so as to keep him from destroying himself. So the idea that Colossus seems to logically feel that the best thing it can do for humanity is to run it. And after all, without the ability to wage war, mankind can now turn its aspects to more beneficial problems. As of course it's also on the control of a machine that will quite happily nuke a city if it decides that they've been misbehaving. To the growing desperation of Dr. Forbin and his associates as they realize how fast they're losing control. To the end where mankind has to make a choice, and we can't necessarily guarantee that they'll decide to go with Colossus, and after the ending credits, the end may ultimately be a blasted Earth with only Colossus and Guardian alive because man said no. A very interesting, provocative film with a lot of building tension. Definitely recommended. This one may be rather cheap in its animation. For example, the fact that all the humans are bald is because they didn't have the budget to properly animate hair. But it definitely looks at the alien invasion viewpoint from the other side of things. In this case, the humans are the invaders. And not all of them are necessarily evil. They've come to this planet, it's the closest one they were able to reach. Their ship is breaking down. They've only got maybe a few months of oxygen remaining, and everything else is literally falling apart at the seams. They have to settle here, or mankind is extinct. So the hero has to decide whether or not to help his people or help the natives who are being threatened by this crazy guy who thinks humanity comes absolutely first. With the added benefit that the aliens barely survived their own global apocalypse, they know full the dangers of what's going on. This is definitely not black and white. There's different aspects to both sides, and even a supposed villain of the piece can be understandable, given that this is mankind's only hope. And as a military man, he feels the best way to deal with the situation is to get rid of the natives, for the survival of man can be paramount. Very thought-provoking. While many people consider 1950s science fiction movies to be cheap, and indeed a lot of the B-movies at the time kind of bear this out, Forbidden Planet is a big-budget extravaganza with fine acting, wonderful writing, and a really solid story. It's about our inner selves, and how the Krell created this machine to make themselves gods to find that they were just as flawed as the more primitive beings they'd evolved from. As Morbius himself says, after a million years of shining sanity, they could hardly have understood the power that was destroying them. How even the supposedly enlightened Morbius, with his artificially enhanced intelligence, can't control the raging beast within himself, even to the extent of threatening to destroy his own daughter. Everyone involved in the production is very good. It introduced the hugely popular character of Robbie the Robot. It would show up in everything from Mork and Mindy to The Twilight Zone to an episode of The Thin Man, of all things. And for those of us who may only have been aware of Leslie Nielsen in his later years as a comedic actor, he is a very solid and effective leading man. This was a third of the Quatermass films that were adopted from the original BBC serials, and I think it's the most faithful. There's a lot of important stuff going on here. From the beginnings of the fact that mankind is still struggling against their own hatreds and wars, even as they prepare to head off into space, to the fact that the Martians may have actually been responsible for instilling these developments in mankind, or at least increasing them, since battles is necessary for a species to survive overall, to the idea that even if the Martians hadn't done this, we might not even have actually survived. So the ultimate end of the idea that the racial purge is part of the responsibility for an imagery of the devil within our own minds, and the wild hunt when the hives were being purged, and that sort of thing like that. Very provocative in the scientific analysis of the idea of how myths can become part of our culture because they're based on something more important. The idea of science shaping our minds to create a reason for our darker desires, and some very effective acting, especially that scene where the drill operator is going through this sort of mental breakdown in the church, ranting about huge up into the sky and running and leaping. Now the sky is dark. Very effective, quite spooky, and I think one of the best of the Hammer film adaptations. Now I know what you're thinking. Flash Gordon is a good movie? Well, yes it is. Well, it may look cheap, it had a very high budget, and the thing is, it's supposed to look this way. The actors are supposed to have this sort of attitude, and the whole thing is supposed to look really bizarre, weird, and cheap. That's the entire point. It's made of kitsch. It uses great splashes of color. It has hugely elaborate set pieces and people who act big and boisterous. And yeah, of course, you can't go wrong with Brian Blessed, or as I call him, the man with no indoor voice, as Voltan. So despite the fact that it looks silly, it's supposed to be silly. It takes the old comic strips and splashes them onto the screen like you're spraying it with a hose. It's just great and glorious and exciting, and it's not meant to be taken seriously. In fact, the film itself actually does itself in a serious way. It's just accepting what happens on the screen, because if at any point it even once winked at the camera, the effect would have been ruined. It's Flash Gordon as the way Flash Gordon should always be done. And I love it for that. When Japanese films, especially kaiju, began to be more accepted overseas, one of the first that was adapted was Godzilla King of the Monsters, regarded by many as one of the first kaiju films. That, yeah, of course, it had been a large pedigree, starting with things like King Kong and the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So there was a lot of American elements in it. But what I like about this adaptation with Raymond Burr is that it doesn't make him the hero. He's a victim just as much as the people of Tokyo. And his elements being introduced in the story, and being an old college buddy of Shirazade and so forth, even though they share no actual on-screen moments, since he's not really part of the film per se, provides a very effective bridge for the story. And although the ending is slightly different, when they're talking about how Godzilla's dead and everything's fine, whereas in the original, the Doctor was talking about how they had to be careful lest they unleash more Godzillas, which did ultimately happen, by the way. I think it's a very effective way of bringing the elements of the Japanese film to the American audience, and showing that these people who, a mere 10 years earlier, had been described as being an inhuman enemy, are just as human and vulnerable and prone to acts of heroism and flaws as anyone else in the rest of the world. While it may be considered to be kind of silly in some aspects by Western audiences, I think it's just as effective as the original Gojira, and if you can watch both, do it. This could be considered one of the first zombie apocalypse films, even though it came out before the 1968 film of Night of the Living Dead. It's got just about everything you would imagine of him. It's got a desolate city. To me, if you got a movie like this, some of the most frightening scenes and the most viscerally unsettling scenes is a city street that's completely empty. Maybe a few stray dogs, or just the wind blowing papers across the way. A city that used to be full of action and excitement in life, now dead. To me, that's really frightening. And Vincent Price is wonderful as the main character. This is one of the most faithful adaptations of the original novella, I Am Legend, and I think one of the best versions too. Price is wonderful as the character who is just struggling this side of sanity just to stay alive. And the ending, where he realizes that he's been killing the innocent as much as the guilty, but still feels that he's been justified in this since it's a matter of him surviving, and he sees himself as the last true human, is highly effective. Especially the ending where the woman, even though she's been cured and could possibly cure others, comments how all the monsters are finally dead. Very effective adaptation of the story, and one I definitely recommend the most. This film is very similar to a trope called the generation ship. It's a concept in science fiction where if you send people off to distant destinations, such as say a distant star, but you don't have access to FDL drive, you have to send them in basically real time, and several generations will be born on the ship as you go, so the people that arrive at the destination may not even really be aware of the true circumstances of where they are or what their ancestors did. And this effect is only 200 years, but the whole idea is that they were deliberately kept from having any information about the world above, so they wouldn't feel bad about what had been lost, but it also meant that they were inclined to stay below, especially when the information about how to leave was lost, and there's a good possibility that they could be the last survivors of mankind, and if they die, man dies. It's a literal leap of faith to follow the instructions left by the almost mythical builders to try and escape, and no guarantee that absolutely everyone who receives the information at the end, thanks to them dropping it down into the city, will actually choose to leave. Some people may decide to stay behind in the comforting place they've always known and ultimately die, and only a few may be brave enough to enter out into the world and let the ember of mankind flame anew on the surface. While it wasn't very successful, thus preventing any adaptations of the further books in the series, which aren't really that bad, by the way, I definitely think this was a pretty good standalone film, and one I would definitely recommend. Books aren't always adapted very well. Some aspects can be scale or needs for large budgets, or simply a major difference between the tone of the book and the tone of the person actually directing it. See the difference between Robert's Starship Troopers and the completely different, and in my case not very enjoyable, version of Starship Troopers. But in this case, though they had to be understandably moved way back in scale from the planet-wide invasion to just one state at first, I think they did pretty good. There's a few major plot holes, like how they don't immediately check to see if Sam has one of the slugs on him before he heads off and begins to infect others. But Donald Sutherland does a very good job for his relatively limited screen time. Sam is pretty good. The relationship between him and Mary is also good, growing naturally and developing very well throughout the course of the story. And although some people may be a little turned off by the fact that it's essentially a nude scene, the scene with him sobbing in the shower and her coming to comfort him is, I think, very effective. Sam acts like a man who's been raped, and he's struggling to cope with this, and Mary is there to help him along, showing the state of their relationship to that point and how it can continue to grow and prosper. While some might think they're a little bit goofy, I think the practical effects of the creatures are very effective. Keith David is wonderful as always, and he has a fantastic death scene. And I think Robert himself would probably have enjoyed this version of the story. Okay, put down the pitchforks and torches. Yes, Kung Fury is a great movie. In fact, it's a great movie. Yes, it's only half an hour long, and yes, it's incredibly cheesy, but that's the whole point. This is a movie that is a loving homage to the 1980s. It's bizarre and goofy and over the top. They throw in little things like the big fight between the hero and the arcade machine, with the literal tracking static on the screen indicating this scene is so awesome that whoever recorded this on TV in the first place has played it so much the tape has become worn through. Everything about it is just gloriously and over the top and just fantastic. It's the kind of movie where you watch it and you think, I don't know what the hell I watched, but damn, I loved it. Every bit of it, from the corny dialogues and the fact that there's a Triceratops in a police uniform on the force and nobody even blinks at this, to Hitler's plan apparently involving an army of kung fu warriors, to Hitler himself being a kung fu fan. It's just one great big gory glorious hodgepodge of 80s, and it is fantastic. If you haven't seen it, go watch it! I'm some Canadian critic, and here's to a lot more good movies and a lot more fun episodes.